Into the Spider-Verse won Sony Pictures Animation the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature Film. We all get to see the magic on screen, but what about the technology, innovation and talent that goes into creating the Spider-Verse? Well, we're delighted to explore that by stepping behind the screen with Sony Pictures Animation's Head of Production, Pam Marsden, everybody.
Hello, everyone. I am Pam Marsden. I'm the head of production for Sony Pictures Animation, which we call SPA, or more ironically, SPA. I'm excited to be here at the Collision Conference for the first time to talk about our studio and the making of our latest animated feature, the Academy Award-winning Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm very lucky to have begun my second career early in the history of CG animation, before the historic release of Pixar's Toy Story. My first career was in Chicago and New York, where I worked as a production stage manager for live theatrical events and as the managing director of the International Theater Festival of Chicago. So I was in Chicago when I received a call from a friend at Disney because it turned out that Disney Studios wanted a dinosaur movie and they wanted a CG studio. I asked, what's a CG? I left Chicago for what was described as a 6-month test. And I started work with a team that included leaders from Disney's historically fabled storytelling and traditional animation pipeline, veteran live-action visual effects producers, live-action camera operators, stop-motion animators, and rocket scientists, actual rocket scientists, and me, a theater producer who didn't understand the term a shot. I had to sneak into the ladies' room to ask a friend if a shot was the same thing as a scene in the theater, and it isn't. It didn't really matter that none of us had a background in what we were about to undertake at that time. No one had the background to do what we wanted. I remember that Jurassic Park was considered miraculous because it had a whopping 83 visual effects shots. And people said our movie couldn't be done because it had almost 1,300 shots. I'm sure we achieved the success of even releasing the movie at the time because we didn't understand the challenges that a production period would bring. And then my 6-month test turned into a 6-year production period, and I got my first theatrical producing credit on Walt Disney's Dinosaur. The evolution of CG animation has so far outdistanced that early movie, and I eventually moved to Sony Pictures Animation in 2005, where I produced Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and its sequel. But the heart of that early team, which was full of collaboration and curiosity and innovation and professional respect, remains the same in our industry, and that's why I fell in love with animation. And so now I run production at a scrappy studio with great ambition. So let me speak briefly to our process. Our studio is responsible for the IP creation, or the front end of animation production. We are comprised of directors and story artists and visual development artists and editors, as well as the creative and production executives who provide the necessary support and oversight. Our mutual objective is to get our filmmakers' vision up on the big screen at SPA. We are committed to making big, bold movies where the hand of the filmmaker is strongly felt. We achieve this primarily through a 2-pronged approach. We create the story side by generating a series of animatics, which are essentially hand-drawn storyboards edited together with dialogue and effects and music to allow us to visualize the film as a whole in a very early stage. And the second prong, we approach the visual side by allowing filmmakers to work with production designers and visual development artists to explore the look of the film, including character design and environments and the overall aesthetic. So let's talk about Spider-Man, our most ambitious film, and some of the techniques that were used to create a new and very special experience for our audiences. And first of all, it was truly an incredible undertaking. And a team of over 800 artists and technicians pushed themselves every step along the way to expand the boundaries of what an animated film could look like. They were inspired by the story they were telling, and filmmakers took a leap of faith. When challenged, all areas of our studio innovated, and in the process, we developed a brand new visual language for animated storytelling. So our risk truly paid off. And I'll start from the beginning. The idea came about when two of the film's producers, Amy Pascal and Avi Arad, who had already made many successful Spider-Man movies, wanted to explore making a big animated Spider-Man movie. Eventually, experienced producer Christina Steinberg, who had worked extensively in animation, was added to the mix. That group approached Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who are a very successful filmmaking duo who began their career at SPA, making Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 10 years ago, and then they went on to live-action success at Sony with the 21 Jump Street movies. Chris and Phil weren't originally interested in making this movie because they didn't know how they could expand on the Spider-Man canon. But they agreed to think about it. And they came back with this proposal. They would take it on, but only if they could tell the story of a new Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Miles was introduced to the comics in 2011, and he's been a fan favorite ever since. He's half African American and half Puerto Rican, and he's a boy. So he brings youth and diversity to the character that we've never seen before on the big screen. We were, of course, really excited to tell his story and to do it in a unique way. The team knew from the beginning that we needed to distinguish the Spider-Man from others, and we decided to use animation and develop a new visual language for our film. We were ready to break from traditional methods. As we often find, it's helpful to identify a style as inspiration, and it helps guide the visual development. In the case of the Spider-Man, we went back to the original inspiration, the original Spider-Man comic books. Several key impressions from comic books guide style choices. Paneling and in-frame text are signatures of the format. And then we could use that to associate the movie's visuals with the comics. Bold graphic design, vivid colors, strong dynamic character poses, dramatic camera angles. All of these are used to help make comic books engaging and active. And we decided to take those to also employ them and evoke a comic book style. Many artists on the early development team were avid comic book readers, and they loved the gritty feel and look of the printed comic book. So they celebrated the imperfections within the illustrations and saw them as signatures of a style rather than mistakes. And production designers committed to these ideas as a design aesthetic, and they brought the comic books to life. Spider-Man is set in a dense urban environment, and we needed to portray the kinetic energy of Miles's world. So the rendering process, however, requires a tremendous amount of rendering for multiple shots of layered animated backgrounds. So we wanted to simplify and control those backgrounds. So the talented men and women inside Sony Pictures Animation and our partners, Sony Pictures Imageworks, began to experiment. This is the very first object that was created for the film. And it does look like a simple traffic cone, but there were countless meetings about this object. The traffic cone actually was instrumental in setting the look of our movie. What excited us so much about it is the incorporation of graphic textures and paint strokes on a stylized and deconstructed model. That simple object led to one of our earliest animation tests created for the film. The focus of the test was to establish rules for what we called level of detail, which is the concept of simplifying details on objects that are farther away from the camera. Instead of blurring them out, which is a common technique, we simplified the style and design, which means that we could make design choices and have greater control over our final image. To illustrate this idea, the team developed an initial test, which started with this painting from our Viz Dev team. The team at Imageworks set up a camera, modeled the environment, added texture and some motion in the background, and this is what we got. So I'd like to draw your attention to the traffic crossing the street in the background of the shot. Specifically, I want you to look at the level of detail there. This is what you're looking at. The traffic moving in the background is actually abstract, appealing shapes that provide the look and feel of motion in a stylized way. This concept was adopted throughout the film. Here's another look at those animated shapes. It's another example of our early test to illustrate the concept of using level of detail. As you can see, the focus of the shot is on the motion of our character as he moves through the cities. The buildings and vehicles are all animated, and you'll notice that at one point in the shot there's a bus full of people that goes by in the background. If you look closely, you can see that the people in the bus are not made up of 3D geometry, but rather this still painting. And it's this technique of simplifying and stylizing elements in our shots, which make for a more efficient render, while also contributing to the overall unique look we were going for. And one day during pre-production, in a typical review of a large batch of Viz Dev, the artist brought in this piece. The filmmaking team really loved how the artist had included edge breakups and severe shadows. And then they also commented on the use of simplified silhouettes. And then they pressed play. When that shot came to life, we knew we were really onto something. Next, I'd like to show you a video in which visual effects supervisor Danny Dimian and head of animation Josh Beveridge and Justin Thompson, our production designer, talk about what went into bringing these ideas together.
Early on, when we were first approached by Chris Miller and Phil Lord, their request for us was to come up with a new visual language that would bring the comic book to life.
We spent a year just testing and trying to find the look of this project, and we got to pick and choose our favorite things from the live-action real world and the cartoon world and combine them to make this comic book work. I think here we're kind of perfectly poised to do that because we do both.
As someone who grew up reading comic books and sort of obsessed with comic books and being influenced as an artist by comic books, I've always looked at the page and noticed all of the misprints and the CMYK offsets and the screen tones that went into making them. It's the printing process that I was always very aware of, and I thought that would be a really interesting way to make 3D look different, to just take that two-dimensional printing process and apply it to a three-dimensional world.
We actually ended up looking for every little error that occurred on the show that looked interesting. We ended up looking at it and going, is that something that we could use? Is that something that is cool?
I think I've always had an aspiration to make a movie that didn't just honor the art of book, but actually looked like the art of book. So I said to Danny Dimian at the very beginning of the project, I said, I want the audience to be able to stop any frame, and it should look like a piece of artwork. I don't think you should have to like look at the art of book and say, oh, they kind of did it. I wanted them to be able to compare like the artwork we did to the frames and see as close a match as we could.
Looking at the art that we wanted to be inspired by, most of that imagery is more about the lines and the form and the color. There's not as much material properties to it. So our rendering technique relies a lot more on something that looks more like an illustration than, say, a more traditional material-based look. And some of the things that we do to try to make it look like it's hand done and like it's actually hand illustrated, we came up with a few things that we noticed over and over again in the comic book. Shadows are typically hatched, and a lot of the highlights and the transition of smooth colors are done with half-toning. So we typically try to avoid smooth color transitions and use a half-toning or a printing technique through our rendering and our compositing to actually pull that off.
Another challenge the team faced in differentiating the look of this film from all other animated features was how to approach animation, how our characters would actually move.
When we first started doing animation tests, it became very clear to us that in order to make it feel like a comic book, there was something snappy about the comic book. The poses were really important. So we had to approach animation.
Animating on twos is more of a traditional technique. It's a term from the hand-drawn animation era. They would do 12 frames for every second, where in computer animation we traditionally do 24 frames for every second. You get a very different feel. Once you get used to it, it can feel what people have called slightly choppier, but we embraced that as part of our style and made it as a creative choice because it felt more pop art and graphic.
The idea that not using motion blur, sometimes if things are moving too fast, you can't watch it. It'll strobe across the screen. So we had to have a way of controlling that strobing effect. We turned back to our CMYK offsets, we turned back to our misprints, we turned back to like the comics when line work would get off register, when sometimes if you had a really bad printing, maybe the image might get distorted a bit and stretched and maybe printed across 2 frames by accident.
That decision to do that with animation actually ended up rippling through every department and how we would do everything. One example of that is simulating cloth. The fact that we didn't have every frame animated meant we had to come up with new techniques and a new pipeline to actually deal with the fact that we didn't have smooth animation.
One of the most important things Josh mentioned in this video is the concept of animating on twos, which was one of the most fundamentally risky moves the animators took on the film. Again, it's a scary leap of faith, but required when we're entering into the process of creating something that hasn't been done before. To help illustrate what went into this, here's a breakdown of the exploration and experimentation that the animation team engaged in to protect the animation style, to perfect the style. In this example, animation is done on twos, meaning the character's pose changes every 2 frames or 12 times per second as opposed to the 24 frames. The camera move is also on twos, but the result is a camera move that's choppy and distracting. In the next example, we reverted to a more traditional CG camera on ones to solve for the choppy camera. As you can see, it's super choppy and the result is worse. So what we ultimately did is try splining the animation, which means that we animated both the camera and animation on ones, but it looked like the traditional CG animation you see today. And that's a step in the wrong direction. So this was not going to lead to the fresh approach we wanted to take. So finally, we figured out how to accomplish the shot with the character animation on twos. We made up for the jitter caused by the second test by sliding the character over every other frame, so you can still feel the characters animated on twos, but you lose the choppy feel that wasn't working. And this was a huge breakthrough for us, and the first time this type of animation has been used in a feature-length CG film. Here, what's inspiring is the idea of taking something old or existing and making it new by way of smart and modern reinterpretation. So although these pieces emphasize the technical aspects of achieving the unique Spider-Verse look, They hopefully also demonstrate what's so powerful about the animation process, and that we iterate and iterate and iterate again until we achieve our goal. The process of constant iteration can be exhausting, but it's deeply rewarding. Animation is the medium where storytellers, if given the time and the resource and the freedom, can be the most expressive. And there, I'd like to add one more thing. We could never make an animated feature in a style that is so fresh if we didn't have the iconic Spider-Man story to work with. The epic scale of the message that anyone can wear the Spider-Man mask and bring forth a hero from within was embraced by crews as well as general audiences. In the Spider-Verse, battles are scary, villains have guns, people die. This is unusual content, and the tone calls for a look that is more edgy and sophisticated. A traditional animated movie meant for family audiences would never support the break from traditional style you see in the Spider-Verse. Because of the familiar, legendary story and the appeal to audiences of all ages, we had the perfect platform to expand the use of animation. So when people suggest that Spider-Man changed the face of animation, it's important to remember it was the epic hero story driving the creative team to take the leap of faith. And that's an in-depth look at our studio and the making of Spider-Verse. Our studio is a filmmaker-driven studio where it's our sincerest mission to support filmmakers and bring their creative visions to fruition. Thank you for being here.